My people are the Gundungurra, so we're from the Blue Mountains, New South Wales. And I was born in Katoomba. That's sort of like traditional land where my people come from. It's down in the Jamison Valley, Burra Valley. I had an apprenticeship. I was offered an apprenticeship to be a pastry chef at the Hydro Majestic, because I used to pick a girl up and take her to school and bring her home for her dad, and he was the head pastry chef at the Hydro Majestic, and he said, "Do you want an apprenticeship? Because I like to cook." I said, yeah, no worries. So I was when I turned 17, I was going to do this apprenticeship. But my dad got a job, because my dad worked for the council and he ran a treatment works in North Katoomba, and he got a job in a place called Canoundra, central New South Wales. So we moved there, and I lost the apprenticeship, and I went for an Indigenous kid in the middle of central New South Wales. There's a mission at Cowra, which is not too far away, no jobs, not a great place. How do I get out of here? What's the quickest way out? And I went, I can join the Navy when I'm 15. So I joined the Navy, and at that time they had bakers, and I thought, I can be a baker. So I went to HMAS Lewin. You did 12 months as a junior recruit, and at the end of your service at Lewin, they basically asked you to give 3 choices, and I had underwater control. Well, my first choice was cook, underwater control, and clearance diver. And basically they said to me, "Oh no, you're too smart to be a cook." But I said, "I want to be a baker," and they went, "Oh, we've just got rid of bakers." So they said, "Oh, you're going to be an electrician, and if you fail the electrical course, you're going to be a clearance diver." And I went, "Oh, clearance diver? Vietnam's on," and I wasn't particularly interested in crawling through a swamp while the locals were shooting at me. So I thought, okay, I'll become an electrician. So I became an electrician. And my first ship was HMAS Duchess. They sent me the Duchess. Duchess was in refit, so basically with a refit party in Sydney, and I was an ODM, ordinary seaman electrical mechanic, and then they took me off Duchess, sent me out to Narimba for a while to paint rocks. A good thing the Navy used to do, if they got nothing to do for you, you go and paint rocks. So you just painted rocks around the depot. I planted something like 300 rose bushes in front of the wardroom, and these are the days when the Navy used to have pig farms on their bases, and I also worked in the pig farm. It was a culture shock because to go to Lewin, you crossed Australia, and we did by train. So we all mustered down at the railway station in Central, and none of us had ever been. I'd always been a bit of a kid who liked uniforms because I was in the Cubs, the Scouts, Air League, and Army Cadets before I even joined for real. So I kind of liked the military life. But we'd all, if your family brought you to the railway station, Central Railway Station in Sydney, first off, we went to HMAS Cuttable. Then the family dropped off at Cuttable. Then the Navy took you over. And at that time, when I joined the Navy, said, "All right, your train leaves at 8 o'clock at night. We'll take you down to Garden Island, give you a look at a couple of ships, and give you a bit of familiarisation," which is kind of interesting because when they took us down to the wharf, they took us on to HMAS Melbourne. Melbourne had just run over the Frankie Evans, and she had this big chunk out of the front of it. And we went down there and, "Oh, this is handy. This is what you're going to expect." So then you went to the railway station. They bussed us to the railway station, and that's when you really started to know you're in the Navy, because they had a bunch of leading seamen, and petty officers who started screaming at you then and getting you all into little groups, and then they got you into the train. And then in those days too, there wasn't a straight train line, so you went to Albury-Wodonga, changed at Albury-Wodonga, then you went to bloody Melbourne, then Melbourne you went Adelaide, changed at Adelaide, then you changed at Port Pirie, and so you did about a 3-day train trip to get there. And I think we lost about 40 blokes before we even got to Lewin who'd had enough, didn't want to play. And we were 2 intakes, Collins and Walton, the 28th intake. So we were quite a big, several hundred of us, and they split us into two intakes. And then you did your 12 months at Lewin. Your 12 months at Lewin was basically, you went back to school, so you did geography, mathematics, physics, navigation, ship's husbandry, firefighting, drill, PT. So it was like high school with military stuff. And then at the end, you were categorised, and then you went to do your sea training, and then you went to do your trade training.
What's it like?
But it was culture shock for me just to go across Australia in a train. And you know, you're 15 years old, you've never left home. The furthest I'd gone to play football or something, you know, about 100 miles. And I went, oh my God, you know. And it was a culture shock for some kids. They just couldn't handle it. And then you went into this other world, this Navy world, and they made me the creature I am today. I'm so fussy and anal about where things are stowed and how things are done and how things are tidy. I mean, that's how they turned me into that creature. I found that, you know, you make your own bed, you had to do it a special way, and you had to pull it all apart and do this kit musters, and, you know, everything had to come in your locker, had to be this. I came home for 6 months, for my first 6 months away, and my parents went, what have they done here? And I couldn't talk to the school kids, kids I went to school with, because I went, you fools. They turned you into this other creature, and that because they broke you down and then built you up into this beast that they wanted. And I mean, I'm still that person. It worked, but it was a big culture shock from there to there. And then there's another culture shock when you get on a ship and you all got to live in a space. And if you don't get on with people, where are you going to go? You know, and I mean, in those days too, bastardisation ruled. I mean, at Lewin, it was like someone did something wrong, so at 1 o'clock in the morning, you're all down there with your beds rolled up over your head, running around the bloody parade ground at 1 o'clock in the morning. It was pretty tough, but I enjoyed it actually. It was just something that, you know, I gravitated to. Some of us in my class, all the classes that came out of Lewin with me, some of those guys went to the Vendetta. Vendetta took over the gun line, I think, when it was either Perth or Hobart got shot up. And so they did gun line stuff. But Sydney was also a training ship, so it was chock full of bloody ordinary seamen. I mean, there was at one stage when I was on, there was about 60 odd of us, you know, because you had to do, after you left Lewin, you had to do at least a minimum of 6 months sea time to get all that seamanship stuff sorted out. Like, you know, you had to be on the helm, and you had to do lookouts, and you had to do boat stuff. So that was the way the Navy trained its young recruits, its junior recruits, 6 months sea time, and sometimes if you're, and that was the problem too, because as an electrician, the electrical course lasted longer than most other courses. So if you got on the Sydney and your course didn't start until next year, you're on the Sydney till your course started. Some guys were on there and they were for 3 or 4 weeks, did their season, and they were gone, and they were back as rated sailors before you'd even left, because they'd gone to do the seamanship course, which might be 2 months long or whatever somewhere else. There were some really good ones. There were some right bastards too, you know, because it's a power trip. You got 100 bloody people you can boss around, and I ran into some of them later on, and I actually was a higher rank than them because they'd been busted back, you know. And I went, you know, I remember you when you were a right bastard. Look at you now. But the majority of them were there because they were good at what they did. They were good trainers. They were usually blokes who are a little bit older than most. They've been around the world. They've seen a fair bit, and it was also a place for them to basically relax in a sense. So they were more about telling you how things work, you know. I mean, yeah, on the parade ground you're getting screamed at, and the PDIs were screaming at you, and, you know, it was the military training. But a lot of the other instructors, I mean, you know, we did geography and things like that, so they were Navy, but they were schoolies. They were in the Defence Force because they were educators. So they weren't really there to be bastards to you. They were there to educate. And I mean, and that's the thing too. They wanted education, ship's husbandry, firefighting, damage control, and nuclear, biological, chemical defence stuff. They wanted you to learn that. You needed to learn it, so they didn't go out of their road to really make life miserable for you. It was a learning curve. And they drafted me onto the Sydney to do my sea time training. HMAS Sydney, and Sydney was doing the trips backwards and forwards to Vietnam. So I did a couple of those. I think it was either 3 row up and 7 back, or the other way around, I can't remember. And we took a bunch of trucks as well, international trucks, up to Vietnam as well. So I spent about 6 months doing trips backwards and forwards. And as a trainee electrician at ODM, my job was also to be the dogman for the seaplane crane. The Sydney had a seaplane crane, which was an electrical crane, and it was had a really smooth movement to pick things up and down. So my job was to be the dogman when we'd come alongside in Vietnam. They would either come alongside. Sydney carried landing craft, so you'd either drop the landing craft and load stuff into the landing craft and take them ashore, or you'd take troops ashore. When we had troops on board, they would either go off in Chinooks or they would go off in barges. 2 times I was there, I think they both went off in Chinooks. But we used to run our landing craft backwards and forwards to pick stuff up. When we had the trucks on board, my job was to basically hook the trucks onto the seaplane crane and lift them off onto the barges alongside, which can get a bit frightening too, because if they slipped in the nets or whatever, because you run them onto a net, the bloody things would tip sideways and the stuff in the back of it would fall out all over the place. I turned 17 on the way there, my first trip. So, and it was kind of funny, when I joined the Navy, I had no concept of Vietnam. I had no concept of going there. I didn't pay attention to the news, so, it was just something that... And then when it happened, I went, oh, yeah, it just happened, So I didn't actually join the Defence Force thinking that I would go somewhere like that. I just joined to basically get away from a middle of nowhere bloody town. My dad's the Indigenous one in the family, my mum's not. My mum was adopted as a baby, and her adoptive father was a Church of England minister, and he was an ex-chaplain in Darwin during the Second World War. And he always had a thing about the Navy, and he gave me a book for a birthday present called HMS Ulysses, and it was a book about a British ship in the Second World War. And I'd been interested in poetry too, and I learned parts of a poem called the HMS Jervis Bay, the Jervis Bay, and that sort of sparked an interest in me in about the Navy, and then because I wanted to get away from this country town, the quickest way that I could do that and get a wage and travel the world and do the things that I could probably never ever do as an Indigenous kid in a country town was join the Navy, and the Navy offered that opportunity to get away at 15, which is quite interesting because many years later, when I was working at the War Memorial and I started the service up the back of the War Memorial, the War Memorial now we have an Indigenous service every Anzac Day, we have a service every November 11th, and we used to do it up the back of the hill behind the War Memorial. There's a little memorial up there. The guy and his wife who put that up there, it was a private memorial, was a fellow named Michael Thwaites. Michael Thwaites wrote that poem, The Jervis Bay, and I got to meet him. It was kind of, and things just sort of clicked together, but really it was a case of the quickest way out of this town was to join the Navy. I can remember on ships, there were guys on ships who'd served in the Second World War and Korea. Very rarely did you see some Vietnam ribbons. I can remember seeing more guys wearing Korean War medal ribbon bars and Second World War ribbon bars. We used to have these things. They used to call them Queen's Kellicks or King's Kellicks, Queen's Kellicks. They were leading seamen. They'd been in the Navy for so long, they were basically, that was the rank they were ever going to be, and they were given that rank. And these guys, had 3-4 ribbon bars because they'd been in the bloody Second World War in Korea. It was and the thinking was the same. And when I trained at Lewin, you were trained with film footage and documentation from the Second World War in Korea. So the thinking, you're still living in the past. It was still very much in the past. So all your damage control stuff was done from training films which were made in the Second World War about British ships, how to save ships if they were sinking. Your equipment on ships like the Duchess and the Sydney was all Second World War stuff. So it's still a different way of thinking. Soldiers were different too. I mean, you see a soldier today and they're bulked up. They carry a lot of equipment, they're bulked up. I mean, most of these guys, if they were 8 stone ring and wet with all the equipment on them, it was a totally different defence force and a totally different. We were still stuck in that Second World War frame of mind, and we still had those people on board the ships. You'd come in early in the morning, just on sunrise or just before sunrise. You would anchor. They'd put the small boats and the landing craft, if they weren't used, in the water, and they would be dragging for divers, for swimmers and whatever. You worked in the daylight hours. As soon as it started to get dark, you up anchored. If you had not got all your... We trained and trained and trained and trained. I remember we went to New Zealand just to train how to unload stuff and put stuff on, because they wanted us to do it as quick as possible. So we would try to get everything done before sunset, before dark. Once you'd finished, you went out. If you hadn't finished, you would then go back out to sea, open sea, sail around till the next morning, come back in. But you never stayed overnight because it was judged to be too dangerous staying overnight because you can't see what's going on in the water. We never had to stay overnight. We get in and get them done really quickly, and the troop on and off stuff was pretty quick because the off-going unit group would be all lined up in the hangars, and they'd all be relegated to an aircraft, a helicopter or a landing craft. So they'd all be ready to go in their little blocks, and as the Chinooks came in and discharged the troops coming out, they'd go down one side of the boat, down inside, and the other mob would come out and go up. And so it was pretty quick. The stuff that took time was when we had all these international trucks and engines and stuff and all that, and we had to unload them. And that was, you were flat chat till you got it off. The Chinooks were a bit frightening too, because when they came in to land, we had a lot of davits on the flight deck, which for the landing craft. And I can remember once the Chinook came in, it hadn't dropped its troops off yet, and it got its wheels caught in the davit, and it was like everybody run away, because we expected this bloody great big helicopter to do a backflip on the flight deck. But I mean, those kind of things, you just took them as they came. It's a kind of funny place. Vietnam, the part of it, you come in really early in the morning and you just see the lights on the hills and you'd see something happening in the background. But it was a kind of a weird place because everybody seemed to be on edge, and it smelt of avgas. It's a funny place. The whole place smelled of avgas because everywhere you look in the sky there was a bloody helicopter. They were everywhere. The helicopter war, it's just amazing. We did a fair bit of stuff with 9 Squadron, RAF 9 Squadron, because they'd come in on and they were looking for fresh fruit and stuff like that. So we used to cook Anzac biscuits and all that kind of stuff, and then they would come in and get fresh bread and fly in and out all the time. So it was busy. Came in early in the morning, flat chat for about 5 hours, just as it started to get dusk. Then if you hadn't finished unloading, you go back outside, and then you'd sail up and down until the morning, and then you come back in and do it again. The reason was that was for enemy divers, frogmen type work. So we always had landing craft patrolling, dragging grappling hooks, looking for enemy swimmers. If you were a sentry, because we had sentries on board, they gave you an SLR rifle and a magazine, and I had just turned 17. You had a rifle and a magazine, and the magazine was in your pocket, and you weren't allowed to put it in the gun just in case you probably shot yourself. So if anything happened, you actually had to phone up the bridge or whoever, and look, say I see an enemy swimmer in the water or whatever. Then they would tell you that you could put your magazine in your weapon. So it was kind of silly. I mean, if something had happened, you had to actually ring up before you could do anything. But it was a really interesting place. When we had the squatties on board, we couldn't live in the messes because they got all the messes. So we had to sleep in the hangar because Sydney was an old Majestic aircraft carrier from the Second World War, and she did a lot of service in Korea. So we would sleep in the hangars, and they just put up like a metal scaffolding framework, and we were sleeping in hammocks. So you'd sling your hammock in this sort of scaffolding, or if you were lucky, they actually brought these fold-up beds on wheels. They were good until they realised when they got a bit of a roll-up in the rough weather, you were sliding backwards and forwards in the hanger on this, so you had to saw the wheels off them. But the shitty thing about being in the hangar was the fumes from the funnel would get sucked down through the lift well and through the hangar, so you're tasting sulphur all the time. Once the soldiers left, it was really interesting to look at the change in people and the change in men. The new guys would be taken up because we used to do ship concerts and all that kind of stuff. I mean, amazing talent, some of these guys, you know, could sing and play the guitar and all that kind of stuff. Usually they were sort of like either full-time serving soldiers or they were national service, and you really couldn't tell the difference. That's the way they were trained. You really couldn't tell the difference, and there didn't seem to be any animosity between the full-timers and the nashos. So it was really good. But when you looked at the blokes going up, there was a when they were leaving the ship and lining up to go into the helicopters to be taken away, you could tell the difference. You look at their faces, and I mean, these guys were just not much older than me. And they had that look on their faces, I don't know what we're going into type thing. And then when the helicopter lands and the guys come out of the back of it, they were totally different, these guys. They were all laughs and smiles because they were getting the hell out of there. And it was a totally different group of people would pass each other. And the fellas we'd taken over there was some animosity between NCOs and other ranks. I mean, I can remember walking into an argument in one of the messes, and they were threatened for violence. You know, I'll bloody shoot you if you give me a hard time. But I think that was just people were on edge. I don't understand how some of these soldiers would have done it too, because some of them flew in Qantas. They flew in a Qantas aircraft and flew out in a Qantas aircraft. You know, you're going to war and you're flying in a Qantas aeroplane, and you get out the airstrip, and off you go to wherever you're supposed to be barracked. And I mean, they're always doing classes, and they're always doing. We used to do a lot of shoots. So in those days, you used to get, I think they were 5-gallon milk canisters. So we used to save them all up, and I can remember sitting there for hours blowing balloons up. And then what we would do is we'd go from the quarterdeck. The offices where the quarterdeck was, which is under the back end of the flight deck, we would be there, all of us little bloody junior recruits, ordinary seamen, and we'd be throwing over balloons and these milk cans while the soldiers are up on the flight deck above us. Target practice, we used to do. So they were doing all that kind of stuff. They were doing their general military duty stuff, but no one had really told them what it was going to be like at the other end. I met this guy, and we were both 15 at the time, and we were both going to join the Navy. And he goes, "Oh, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know." And I said, I was thinking about submarines. And he goes, "Yeah, I am too." So we thought, we might meet up. Then he was a stoker. He became a stoker, and I became a granny. We were both at Cerberus at the same time, and then his course was shorter than mine, so he went into the fleet. I stayed. We bumped into each other as ords, and then we bumped into each other when we both raided. And we've been mates ever since. We went through Lewin together. When we got out and we were both in the fleet, and I was an electrician and he was a stoker, we went, let's join submarines. So I put my hand up to join submarines, got selected, he got selected. I was on the Perth then, HMAS Perth, and Perth was going to do the first Indian Ocean tour that a warship had done since the Second World War. We were going to go to Mauritius, and we went to Africa and Ethiopia and Iran and everywhere. And I went, whoa, and I whipped out my submarine thing. because I wanted to do the trip. So he went to submarines and I didn't. But the Navy has a long memory. So when I did the after Indian Ocean tour on the Perth, we came back to Sydney, and then into Sydney, and they said, we're going to do a half-life refit, and the half-life refit's in the United States. So I went, oh, this is good. So I stayed on the Perth, went to Long Beach, California for 14 months, did a half-life refit. When I came back, they said, well, now we're going to have to draft you off the ship. So they drafted me to HMAS Platypus, the submarine base, because they must have gone, oh, he'd volunteered for submarines once before. And that's where I hooked up with my mate again, and he'd been in submarines for 3 years or whatever it was at that time. And I got so used to working with submariners because they do things differently. They're not so rank orientated. It was about you. I never saw anybody salute a bloody officer the whole time when I was at Platypus, except on payday. It was like, and it was, they were a really close knit bunch of people, and they did things differently, but they demanded a really high standard of excellence. But when you looked at them, you'd go, what a bunch of pirates, you know. And then when my time finished at Platypus, they then drafted me to HMAS Stewart, the Stewie Maru. And she was just about buggered, and she's looking for a major refit. I mean, we went to Rimpak and never made it to bloody Fiji because the thing broke down and we were dead in the water for 2 days till they flew apart to us to make us work. We broke down on one occasion and we could only go backwards, and the Admiral said, you're not going to come into Sydney Harbour backwards, so they tow us in. So I was on the Stewart. They said, right, we're going to send her in a refit as quick as we can now. We went to Dogtown, to Williamtown and Victoria, and I was the refit crew on it. So there's about 8 or 9 of us, and we just midday went to the pub, you know, it was just hanging around doing this. And we lived at Lonsdale, HMAS Lonsdale. Lonsdale was a Second World War group of buildings, and they were condemned. So you couldn't live in the end buildings. Yeah, all of us lived in and built the rooms in the middle because they reckon the place is going to fall down. And I was at Lonsdale for a while, and then they said, we're drafting you out of Lonsdale and you're going to Stalwart, HMAS Stalwart, Building 215, bloody this horrible ship. And I went there and I was mess deck leading hand, and it was a ship where they put all the misfits and all the bloody useless people and those people who didn't want to go to sea. It was horrible. And
why were you getting sent there?
Well, I got sent there to be the mess deck leading hand. By then I was a leading seaman, so my job was to go there and look after a bunch of people and to run a section. So because it was a refit ship as well, so it had a whole party of refit people, and their job was to refit ships alongside. So it was part of fleet maintenance, and so I was part of the fleet maintenance group. And I had a mess of blokes to look after, and, you know, because I lived ashore, I would come in and go, oh, you know, you're not out of your bunks in time, so I'd get on their case, and they'd leave crap around and stuff sculling, and at lunchtime I'd make them bloody scrub the floors. You know, I'm going to say, look, if you can't look after yourselves, I'm going to hound you till you do. And it reached a head one day where I went, all right, I want you to all stand by your bunks and your lockers. And I went, how come there's 2 lockers here that have got locks on them, and there's no one standing in front of them? And they went, oh, there's no one, they're just spare lockers. And I went, open the lockers. And they went, oh, we don't have the keys. So I went, all right, go get the bolt cutters, pop, and they're all full of booze. And I'd said to these young blokes, and they'd been off whinging about me to their divisional officer, actually, this lieutenant. And I said to them, own up, who owns the grog? And they went, nobody owns up. So I went, all right, everybody grab it and go in the bathroom, we're going to tip it down the sink. So as I said to them later, if you'd owned up what I told you, you got 24 hours to get it off the ship, you know. But I mean, there was a lot of booze, and I went, tip it down the thing. And then about 2 days later, I get called to this lieutenant's office, and he had a go at me, and he goes, oh, there's so many complaints about you, you're a nasty person. And I went, no, I'm not. I said, all I'm doing is my job. I said, those little buggy, grubby bastards need to have their asses kicked. And he went, no, you know, it's people like you we don't need in the Navy because you're going to drive these people out. And I went, good, get rid of them. And we had a bit of an argument, and I went, I'm leaving. And I went, oh, I shouldn't have said that. So I bolted down to the ship's office and said, can I put my submarine thing in? And they went, yeah. So, and within 2 days, I was gone back to Platypus. And then I ended up at Platts, and everybody at Platts said, oh, where did you go? And I went, what do you mean? I said, oh, I thought you were a submariner. I went, no, I had to go back to Skimmerland. And they went, oh, okay. So then I went and did my submarine training in the UK, and then that was the rest of my Navy career, was in submarines. I was lucky because I came there as a surface ship, what they used to call surface fleet skimmers. You just skim along the surface. They used to call you skimmers or targets. And I'd been at Platypus as a skimmer, so so I'd got used to how it worked. So it wasn't such a cultural shock for me. Actually, it was quite interesting because there was 2 Oakleys. There was me and another Oakley, and I was Indigenous and he wasn't, and we were both electricians. So they used to call us, well, they used to call us both Annie Oakley. And they go, well, where's Annie Oakley? And someone would go, which one? They go, positive or negative? I was negative and he was positive. The bloody play on the electric thing. But I got used to the place and I got used to how they do business. So when I joined boats, there was another 5 of us. We went to do our parts 1 and 2 in the United Kingdom at HMS Dolphin. In those days, we didn't have a submarine school, so I had to do it in the UK. And we also, that's where we did the tank, the escape training. So we went to the UK, the 5 of us, yeah. The tank was dry, so I thought, I'm going to have to come back to England to do the tank. We did our parts 1 and 2, then I came back to Platypus, then you do your part 3 on the submarine, your first motor and watchkeeper, all that kind of stuff. Within a year, I was the only one left out of those 5 because the attrition rate for submarines was just horrendous. We could never man 6 submarines, ever. We were always lucky that we had 1 in major refit and 1 in minor refit, and the other 4 we could just maintain the crews on them. So yeah, and then basically you just get used to it. The job was crap. I mean, it was long hours. You know, if you were on a patrol or you were 6 on 3 off, 6 on, or not on a patrol. On a trial patrol, you were 6 on 6 off. You're in defence watches, so you're 6 on 6 off, and in your 6 off, you can't get to sleep. You have to clean the boat, and if there's anything broken, you fix it. So there's times where you don't sleep for days. Normal routines is usually 6 on 3 off, 6 on 3 off, something like that. Unless you're transiting anywhere, and that could be 2 on and 20 off, 10 off. It depends how you work the watch system. But the job, submarines themselves are horrible. But it was funny. Blokes talked about it and went, oh, this sucks, this is a shit job, blah, blah, blah. Anybody else outside the group said that, they'd go for them. You know, submariners, you're only allowed to bitch if you're a submariner. You can't bitch outside of that. And but what I found with them was the manpower, the guys, which is a problem, caused me a problem, was these guys would die for each other. Even if you didn't like the bloke, they would die for them, you know, and they literally would die for them. And it got to the point where you thought more of the guys you were serving with than your family. If you went away and did a patrol, you went away for a while and you came back home, they used to at Platypus, family would meet the boat in the wharf, 10 o'clock, you all go up to the messes, have a smorgasbord, you know, meet and greet, have a good time, and then all the wives and kids would go home. The blokes would stay there, and they'd get liquored to the eyeballs and get the anger and all that shit out of the system and go home the next day. They'd either sleep on the boat or sleep in the mess or whatever, and get try to get that anger out of them. But that was the problem. Every second guy you met in submarines was either on a second marriage or, you know, went through girlfriends like bloody water because of that so dedicated to the job and to the people, they thought more of the people than their own family life. I mean, I had a failed marriage out of it. It was, you know, it was just one of those things where I thought more of these guys than I did for my home life. A crap job, horrible job. The people were just, you got them for life. These guys, I mean, in their eyes, even though I'm in the Air Force, I'm still a submariner. You know, that's the way it is. And these guys, if I died tomorrow, there'd be 20 of them at the house saying to my wife, what can we do for you? You know, that camaraderie, that bond was the best thing as submarines. Ships had the bonds, but the bond in the ships tended to be the electricians did things with the electricians, the stokers did things with the stokers, the cooks did things with the cooks, so, and sometimes you got together. But you tended to move around in those little groups and socialised in those groups. Submarine, there were all the different trades, ratings, but because you lived so close together and there weren't all that many, there wasn't the electrician's mess and there wasn't the stoker's mess. There was the forward mess and the after mess and the wardroom and the senior sailor's mess. So it didn't matter what rate you all lived together. So we lived with, we had a chef and we had seamen and stokers and greenies all in the same mess. So you tended to bond closer. So the whole boat was the bond, not the trade group. So you would, that was different. That was the different part of it too. And a lot of the officers that you got were either ex-senior sailors who then went away and became officers. So there was that other bond too with officers, and they weren't so priggish and stuck up like more so in surface ships, because an officer on a surface ship, you might not come across him for days. On a submarine, you're bumping into him every 2 minutes, because you have to travel. You only got one passageway, and to go anywhere, you got to go up and down that passageway, and everything comes off it. So you're bonded to them as well, and they tended to be a different group type of officer as well, because they had to be. You had to be able to work with these people and get these people, and that's what I found I was really good at. You've got a diving panel. And on the diving panel, it's a 24-volt system, if I can remember it. And what it does is a submarine works basically on the upturned boat principle. You turn your bloody tinny or whatever up, so it'll float because it's got air underneath it. So that's how a submarine works. You've got a pressure-tight tube in the centre where you live, and then you've got the outside tanks. Tanks are open to the sea at the bottom. And in the tops of them, they've got tank tops, they've got valves, and these valves are controlled from the panel. And if you push one of these panel buttons, you can open and shut those valves. So, and that's how you dive. You open them all, they all open, air rushes out, boat sinks. That's pretty basic how it works. So when you shut off from diving, what you got to do then is you go around to where all these valves are in the boat, and you key them off, you lock them all off so that someone doesn't just push the bloody buttons and mucking around or something, and you dive. So it basically shuts it off. So it physically, mechanically cannot operate. Once you do that, you're surface sail, and then your watches get longer because you go on a different watch system. And usually, if you're transiting somewhere like to go on a RIMPAC, it takes you 9 days. It's about 9 days to get to Hawaii to do RIMPAC. So basically, what happens then is there's only probably half a dozen people on watch inside the boat. There's officer of the watch and a seaman up in the fin. Everybody else is just laying on the casing, and you have a barbecue every day and barbies and stop and go swimming and whatever. And that's when you shut down from diving, so you don't dive anymore.
So that trip out to Hawaii you would do as a surface?
Always travel on the surface if you can. If you're not, because it's the quickest way to get there. Underwater you're not as fast, and you burn up your battery. You usually do an equaliser when you leave, which means you run your battery down pretty flat, and then you charge it right up to its maximum point, and then you trickle charge it, or try not. You do what they call float the load, so that when you're propelling through the water and what you're burning electrical-wise, amperage-wise, is coming out of the battery, but the generators are trickle charging it enough so that you're floating the load, so you're not losing anything in your belt battery, and that's what you do on the surface. So they work out how fast the boat's got to go for whatever distance, and then we work that out so that the battery, and you just scoot along on the surface, and you're not losing any power, but you're not making any power. You're just floating the load. And then when you die, you're on your battery, because O-boats, there is no mechanical connection between the diesel and propulsion. The diesels are basically just two big battery chargers, and they charge the battery. So when you dive, you've got to charge the battery. If you can't charge the battery gets lower and lower and lower and lower and lower until there ain't nothing in it, and that means you don't go anywhere. Nothing happens then. So, yeah, it's and then that's when you do snorting and all that kind of stuff. So if you're on a patrol doing sneakies, you really got to watch the battery, and that's where the greenies, we battery dip every 2 hours just to make sure the battery's not playing up or the cells are playing up and things like that. Well, you can operate the tank tops, you can operate them and surface. Well, you don't need to. If they're shut anyway, you've got compressed air in bottles and you just blow the water. That's how you surface anyway. You can blow the water out of the tank and you surface. But you never run the battery down to a point where, because if you run it down to a certain point and it gets too low, it may reverse polarity. If it reverses polarity, you're stuffed. So you would run the battery might down, 15% or 20% or something like that. You try not to go any lower than that. But that battery, if you're not charging it, it runs everything. Everything. Propulsion, all your conversion machinery, lighting, air conditioning, refrigeration, you name it. Communications, everything is in that. 448 cells, about a tonne each. It's not so much of an anger, it's living on the edge thing you got to get off. There is anger too, because when you're on a boat and you're doing a patrol, or you're on a boat and you dive for a long time too, there's always a bit of angst. And I've been in a mess where, blokes, are you going to eat that sausage? Fighting over the food. Because what happens too, if you're going on a patrol and you're away 3 months, you ended up at the end of that, you're not eating the best of food in the world because it's all frozen, and usually when you're on a patrol, you get fed 4 times, not when the watches change, every 6 hours you get kind of fed. So basically there's a lot of pent-up emotion, and blokes, you try not to do it, so you don't want to be fighting the guys in your mess. So there's that pent-up emotion, and you got to blow it out of the system, and usually what they used to do, and this is the bad old days of the Defence Force where, I can remember at Platypus we would go up to the bar at lunchtime and put away 6 schooners and go to work, when I first joined the Navy, I was asked the question, do you drink? And I went, yeah, and they went, good, because blokes didn't trust you if you didn't drink. People did, it was one of those kind of jobs, and it was nothing for guys to be in the bar at lunchtime and put away 6-7 schooners in 50 minutes, and go back to work. And I knew blokes we go back to work on 11 KV switchboard with open bloody switches and stuff, half cut. The bad old days. But it bred that kind of a thing too. But when you came back alongside, you had all that pent-up emotion, all that other stuff that you try to keep in you, and you don't want to take it out on the wife and kids when you get home. So basically blokes would go up the bar, they'd all go home and they'd get a skinful. And that submarines, we used to have a thing too. They used to have what they used to call horoscope reading Friday. Whereas the boat would go, if you're somewhere, would go, or the branch would go to a pub, and the officers would come, and then there'd be no rank, and then you'd all have a few beers, and then you'd tell people what you thought of them. And you usually did it on a Friday. And if the officer had been an arsehole that week, you told him, you're an arsehole. And you got stuck into him. So you had a weekend to get over it, and a weekend to have a think about it, and then on Monday, all would be worked out. And on ovens, we used to have a thing called the drip book. And if anybody on the boat could come down there if something was pissing them off, instead of taking their anger out on somebody, they could write in the book. So you'd write, what such and such is a right bastard, whatever, you get it out of your system because it was in the book. And the captain, you'd come down and read the book every week or something just to get a gauge of how the crew were feeling and who was being an idiot and whatever. So there were these other things that you did to try to get all that pent-up feeling, It's a bloody hard job, and it could be monotonous and your bestest of mates could get on your nerves like that, I was domestic leading hand on Ovens, my last submarine, and I was on the boat for 3 years, and you're only supposed to be on for about 18 months. Not even 18 months, the longest 12 months, because they mentally stuff you. And I got to a point, we were in Hawaii for RIMPAC. We're going to go to RIMPAC, and I just went to the WEO and I said, I can't do this anymore. I've been on this boat for 3 years. What's going on? I've watched 3 captains come and go. I've seen 3 WEOs come and go. Why am I still here? And then I just went down on the wharf and went, I'm not getting on your stinking submarine. and I can remember the captain, he's got the phone in his hand. He goes, Gary, talk to your wife. And I went, no, I'm not talking to her. And this is my second wife. And she goes, if he's not getting on the submarine, he's not getting on the submarine. So they sent me home with about another 3 guys and flew us home, which was a story in itself. And then I had to front the captain, Captain SM of the depot, because basically I mutinied. I refused to go to sea. And he just said to me, I'm going to give you 2 weeks compassionate leave, go home, we'll come back and then we'll talk about what we're going to do to you. And I went, okay. I went home, came back, off caps, and he goes, the weapons electrical officer will apologise to you. And I went, okay. The base WEO, whom I'd known previously in surface ships, and he goes, yeah, I'm sorry, I stopped your promotion to keep you on the submarine. I went, what? And he went, yeah, because you're really good at managing young men. Your boat had the least amount of guys. Submariners run away all the time. You know, they're weekly running. Some of them will disappear for the week, come back, because that's the way they get out of their systems. Then they come back and then they get fined or whatever, and life starts again. And he said, your mess was the best mess because you had very few guys who ran away. You looked after your people really well. Your greenies were all happy, and you're really good at training people. And I went, so you penalised me for doing a good job? And they went, yeah, we stopped your promotion and we kept you on the submarine. And I said, you mentally broke me and you did not promote. And they said, no. I walked out of there, promoted to a petty officer, and basically, what job do you want? And I said, I want an inboard job. I want to work, because I used to work in the powerhouse there. So I said, I want to work in the powerhouse, and I don't want to go to sea. And in the end, they said, how would you like to go to West Australia? Because we're just building up Fleet Base West, new submarine base. We had the new Collins class boats coming in. And I went, nah, I got a daughter, this big. I said, no, I don't want to go over there. I said, I want to go to a place where I don't lose my submarine pay, and I was as far away from the frigging water as I can get. So they sent me to Canberra, to submarine billet in Canberra, and that's how I came to Canberra. When I joined, there was no such thing as Indigenous affairs. I mean, it used to be a joke on board that we would say, oh, where's such and such? Oh, he's gone walkabout because he shot through, and then he turned up a week later, and everybody'd go, why did you do that? You know, black fella, you know, and you'd get fined or number 9s or whatever for it. People didn't understand at that time there was things called sorry business. You know, and I mean, you could say, and I can remember young blokes saying that, you know, my auntie's died, I got to go to my auntie, and they go, but she's not a blood relative, or she's a auntie of somebody, whatever, and they would go, yeah, but she's my auntie, I've got to go, and Defence would go, no, she's not a blood relative, so you can't go, so they'd buzz off. Now Defence understands what an auntie means, because a lot of Indigenous people, kids, were brought up by mum and dad. They might have been brought up by granny or an auntie, or who they call an auntie. So Defence has gone from, don't be trying to pull the wool over my eyes, to, I understand there is a cultural difference now. You are culturally different. And we joined the Defence Force for different reasons, you know. We joined Defence Force because it's about serving country. You know, yeah, I wanted to get a job, but I also had, there's a thing in me that says, it's my duty to serve my country. It's my duty to look after country. It's in my DNA. You know, I've been in the military over 50 years, you know. It's just the way you serve. Now, I can remember when they were bringing in the first Indigenous Affairs unit in the Navy, and I volunteered to be a part of it. And I had a non-Indigenous person say, oh, you're not black enough to be in it. So there was still you're trying to set something up and you people don't understand what culture is and you don't understand the colour of your skin, this kind of stuff. I mean, we still get that today, you know, oh, he's really cultured, he plays the didge and he speaks a bit of language and he's got dark skin. I go, no, you're missing the point, that ain't culture. It's other things. So we've changed considerably on how we do business. All three services have their own Indigenous Affairs units. I sit on a thing called ICAG, which is the Indigenous Cultural Advisory Group for Defence. So that's uniform and non-uniform. Air Force has a thing called SILK, which we're going to change the name soon, which is Senior Indigenous Leadership Circle, which is made up of senior. When you say senior, that's not by rank, it's by culture. Group of people who are an advisory group to Chief of the Air Force, Deputy Chief of Air Force Management on how we use culture in the Air Force. So we've changed a lot. And I was still in the Navy Reserve, but I was working at the War Memorial as a curator at the War Memorial, and I was the War Memorial's first Indigenous liaison officer. And as such, I'd done some work with the new Defence Indigenous Affairs when that was set up. So I did some reserve work for them. And Air Force was setting up their Indigenous Affairs unit, and a guy that was non-Indigenous guy that was working there, he said, I'm going back into Air Force to help set it up. And he worked for Indigenous Affairs Defence. And he went, how would you like to come across and work for us? And I went, oh, I don't know. And then I saw what they were doing and went, Air Force is doing it really well. They're looking at culture differently. They're not siloed and stovepipe like the Army does it. You would think the Army would have the best Indigenous affairs in all three services because they're the service that's had the longest group of Indigenous people in it, but they're not. Where a Navy, Air Force has got like a lot more flatter setup. So I went, yeah, I'll jump ship. And he said, all right, we're going to bring you across from the Navy, because I had paid off as a petty officer, and they said, we'll bring you across and bring you as a squadron leader. And I went, oh, well, a flight lieutenant first, and they bumped me up to a squadron leader. And I actually believed that Air Force was doing such a good job, I quit a full-time job to work as a reservist in Indigenous Affairs. And, but that's how Air Force, which is defence, but how Air Force took it seriously. And today, it's very seriously today. But today we also got to look at, we got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, First Nation people, but we've now, our Defence Force is totally different to what it was when I joined. I remember when I came to Canberra, we never had a Fed guard. So Ross Smith, Warrant Officer Ross Smith, he was ceremonials, Vietnam vet, really efficient soldier Smith, they used to call him, Ross Smith. And Ross would come around and he'd stick his head in and he goes, you, Gary, 2 o'clock this afternoon, such and such, be there. And then he'd go around and then you'd turn up and there'd be 20 of you and you'd be the Fed guard. You'd be the guard. And it was Army, Navy and Air Force. You all had different drill and you all had to do all your own different drill. It was really strange. But we used to do all that stuff. Now the Fed Guard is the Fed Guard. It's a unit in its own right. My time, I would be the odd one out, the Indigenous guy. You look at the Fed Guard today, the face of the Fed Guard. There are people with turbans. There are Sikhs and Muslims and bloody what. All different kinds of people in the Fed Guard. We have Defence has totally changed. The people in Defence Force are totally different to what it was when I joined, because it was very Anglo in my day. Very rarely did you see an Asian, very Anglo and Indigenous members. But today, and that is, I think, causing a problem too, and I brought this up with Indigenous Affairs. I've said, oh yeah, we're all about looking after Indigenous Australians, but we got Sikhs and Muslims who've got cultural differences too. You haven't even looked at how you're bringing those. Yes, we're First Nation people, and this is traditionally our country, but you got to know your Defence Force now is so culturally diversified. I can see that they still haven't looked at how they're going to sort that.
Well, it's a natural
progression.
Yeah. It's the natural question of those people's going, well, why don't we get a...
Well, they're already doing that, going, well, you've got a Department of Indigenous Affairs. Well, why aren't, who do I go to if I've got a problem? And that's the problem. Yeah, who do you go to? Do you have I did some work for the Defence Chaplains, and the Defence Chaplaincy Handbook has nothing in it it has stuff in about Muslims and Sikhs and stuff, and I went, there's nothing in here about Indigenous Australians, First Nation Australians. So I ended up writing the thing on spirituality for Indigenous Australians for the Defence Chaplaincy Handbook. So, you know, somebody's looking at some things and missing others, and some people are looking at other things and missing others. So we're 100 times better off than we originally were. In my 50 years in service, have totally changed, but we still got a long way to go. We've still got some dinosaurs. We've still got problems. Even within Indigenous affairs, we have problems because we mirror just like we do outside in non-military. Is there are always we're our own worst enemies sometimes of First Nation people. You know, we can be the worst bloody bitchy bastards and not working with people, and you know we can self shaft ourselves really badly. So I mean we've got to stop that. We've had problems where we've gone, oh hang on, we have to step back from this because we sound like a dysfunctional community because we're all arguing about stuff. So you know there are certain problems within Indigenous affairs which we're working through. And we're figuring it out, but it's like it's like everywhere. It's like, you know, it's never going to be perfect. But I'm working on the principle that one day we won't have Indigenous affairs because it'll just be business as usual. You know, why should we have special things? You should all be respected for who you are and what you are and where you come from. The Australian Defence Force was the first equal opportunity employer of Indigenous Australians. Even when we were not supposed to be allowed to join the Defence Force, we got into the Defence Force. You know, the race bar was lifted in 1949, yet we served in 2 world wars. When we're not supposed to, because the Defence Force saw us as something different. But what I tell people, and I found this when I'm talking to young kids, young First Nation kids, and I go, why did you join the Defence Force? And they go, oh, you know, I want a job, I want to make money, I want to travel, but I want to protect country. And then they go, and because my dad served in Vietnam and my granddad served in the Second World War, my great-grand served in the First World War, and you go, oh, there's this long connection of service for First Nation people, and it's about being treated as an equal, being able to protect country. But the other thing is defence is kind of like a comfort zone because it's like traditional life. It's tribal. You have Army, Navy and Air Force, you have tribal groups. Within those tribal groups, you've got clan groups. So you've got air crew and submariners and whatever. So there's clan groups. You wear totemic symbols. You wear badges. The Army even has animals. They trot animals out. Totem, you know, they've got goats and bloody tiger and whatever. And it's got an ethic that's very much like traditional life. No one's better than anybody else. You all look after each other. You never leave anybody behind. You share everything. It's very First Nation-y. It's very Aboriginal, you know, Torres Strait Islander Aboriginal thing. It's what you do in your life. So it's like a family. It's like moving from another family group to another family group. So I think that's what makes it comfortable for. And what we're finding in Air Force is First Nation people who join tend to stay in longer than most people. They tend to take it on as I'm only going to be here for 6 years and get a trade. No, I'm going to be here for the long haul. I'm going to do 20 years or plus. You know, they do it, but we do it for other reasons too. We do it. It's in our DNA to protect country. You know, I say to people, you know, I didn't join the Defence Force for the same reason you do, because we think different. We think differently about how we do business.